and I'll tell you a little bit about David. He is, the purpose of this award is to recognize, to celebrate and raise public awareness of exceptional work that significantly advances the mission of the ACSF in architecture, landscape architecture, art, design, urbanism, planning, and related fields. David was chosen for his, quote, scholarship, writing, and teaching in the fields of architectural phenomenology and history, according to the ACSF Board of Directors. David is a professor of architecture at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has taught architectural design, history, and theory since 1984, and served as chair of the PhD program for approximately 2 decades. Before his tenure at Pennsylvania, he taught in England at Cambridge University at the Polytechnic of Central London. He has also visited and taught at many universities throughout the world and has held guest professorships in Europe, South America, and Asia. Leatherbarrow studied architecture at the University of Kentucky, where he earned his Bachelor of Architecture degree, and he completed his PhD in art at the University of Essex under the supervision of Joseph Rickwert and Delabor Velsley. Leatherbarrow's research has focused on various topics in the history and theory of architecture, gardens, and urbanism. More recently, his work has concentrated on ecological issues and the impact of contemporary technology on architecture and the city. When his latest book, Building Time, appears this fall, he will have published 10 books, including 3 cultural anthropologies, 20th century architecture, uncommon ground architecture, technology and topography, the roots of architectural invention, site enclosure and materials, on weathering, the life of buildings in time, and surface architecture, which also won the Bruno Zevi Prize from the International Congress of Architecture Critics. He's published scholarly articles in many architecture journals such as AA Files, Architectural Research Quarterly, and the Journal of the Society of Architectural Historians. This year, the AIA and ACSA awarded Leatherbarrow the Topaz Medallion for Architectural Education. Congratulations, David, on your award. And now I'm going to turn this screen over to you and for your lecture.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Even more, I must say, for the award. I see it as a very great honor, partly because I think so highly of the forum, its orientation and mission, but also because I have a very high estimation of its members, whose scholarship has informed my own. And I must say that I'm truly humbled to join the ranks of the previous awardees, Professors Harries and Palasma, whose work I've been following for decades. I'll tell you anecdotally that it was in 1972, nearly half a century ago, that I wrote a short letter to Karsten, complaining as only a second-year undergraduate architecture could, that his recent essay on ethics and architecture had serious flaws. His reply, equally generous and profound, has been with me ever since. Like you, I trust. I'm certain Falling Water would have been a real pleasure. What I would have done there, in that concentrated point, doesn't really seem appropriate here. We are all separate points on a fairly remote circumference. In discussions with Michael, I decided to tell you about the book he just mentioned, Building Time, which is now being printed and ready for distribution in October, coronavirus willing. It's not a new topic for me. The conclusion to the book just mentioned, my first book, Roots of Architectural Invention, 1993, that conclusion was called Places in Time. The subtitle to my next book, On Weathering, was the life of buildings in time. But it's not exactly an old topic either. There is great current concern with the long-term impacts of all forms of building, the life cycle of materials, and with respect to architectural practice in a narrower sense, I think widespread unease with, I'll call it, the atemporal essentialism that attends to the widespread obsessive concentration on form. So mine is a turn toward, not away from the spatial, but a deeper consideration, I hope, of the temporal dimensions of architecture. And my working premise is that there's not one, but several dimensions to architectural time. And I also believe they should be seen and studied together, even if, and this is these several kinds of time resist perfect synchronization. Methodologically, I have three ways of working in the book, or three interconnected intentions to re-emphasize what we see when dealing with what has been said. Secondly, that one can look at the part in order to understand the whole, which is to say Sherlock Holmes is as good a guide to the return to the things themselves as any philosopher, for he often inspected overlooked details. And then thirdly, my working premise is that different arts help one understand the others, which is to say painting and literature, as much as philosophy and science, can assist us in our efforts to understand architecture. The book, the cover which you see here, is structured in three parts. Each, I want to argue, is a kind of time. The time of the world, the time of the human body in movement, and the time of the architectural project. Another important aspect of the book is that each of its chapters deals with one building or one painting only. I had in mind depth of study and closeness of reading. Each of the three parts in the book is introduced with a study of a painting. It's not that I am a painting historian, but I often use pictorial works because they bring into sharp focus the topics that the complexity of architecture sometimes makes less clear. And then the other important structural part of the book that I'd like to mention at the outset is each of the three parts ends with a study of the same building. That building happens to be by Alvaro Siza. It's his well-known swimming pools outside of Porto. Why end each of the three parts with the same building? Because I'd like to suggest that three kinds of time have roles to play in any project. And I chose that one because I like it so much. But these differentiated temporalities can also be seen to conspire together in the making of a work. So the text has an introduction which has as its task to say why such a topic is important today, that we should make space with time in mind, and three kinds of time, of the world, the body, and the project. And perhaps the way to do this is through close readings of single works, focusing on details to understand the whole. Then, as you can see in this table of contents, the book is just under 300 pages long with 110 illustrations, published by Bloomsbury Press. Part one, The Time of the World, begins with the study of a particular painting, Menzel's Balcony Room, where I study the ambient environment taking possession of the space. And the key characteristic of the environment is its seasonality, its diurnal changes, its fluctuations that I argue animate the space. After that, I turn to Eileen Gray's less well-known house and observe her correlation between architectural definition and the workings of the natural world. Matters of plan positioning, of the adjustable parts of the construction, and generally a thesis about opportunities that buildings respond to and thereby animate lives of the building itself and those that we conduct within it are achieved. Then I turn to a building in Norway. The town is Hamar, is Bamble, Sverafens Villa Busk. And this is a study of the way the physical body of the building records and also anticipates through those recordings patterns of occupation. As I said, I turned from those cases to CISA's project, and the key theme there is the rhythm of the sea, the temporal structure it suggests, and how the body of the building works with and works against the movements in its ambient environment. From there to the time of the human body, moving through space. Again, I begin with a painting, a Dutch painting, 17th century, Nicholas May's Eavesdropper, and watch movement through the space as a key to what happens in architectural, temporal structures of spatial organization. That introduces the way I approach an architecture landscape project just outside of Copenhagen, the Great Louisiana Museum by Bo and Vollert. And there too, it's a matter of passage or of movement, the pacing through its places. The next topic of study is a building recently finished in Hangzhou by Wang Shu, a guest house at the China Art Academy. And through a study of the building, paintings, and Wang Shu's writings, I focus on one of the key topics in understanding the time of bodily movement, which is to say the matter of depth. First of all, distances, and secondly, duration that is structured into depth. And turn again, thirdly, to CISA's project. And this is in many ways a very detailed, I hope disciplined walk through the entire project, studying its accelerations, delays, recollections, anticipations, and so on. The last part of the text is devoted to project time, more or less from the quarry to the construction site, and from the construction site to inhabitation, from that to additions and alterations, and finally to deterioration and ruin. I want to see all of that as the time of the project. It begins with a study of a painting, somewhat improbable painting from the Renaissance by Leonardo da Vinci. And then again, 3 projects. First, Rafael Moneo's magnificent building in Merida, which in some ways builds itself out of ancient Roman foundations into the present. And then a fairly recent building in Chile, outside of Concepcion, by the young Chilean architects, Pitzoff and Ulrichhausen. And turn lastly, again, to CISA's swimming pools to account for the full temporal structure of an architectural project. So to quickly give you some images that attend to those topics, this is the von Menzel painting, Eileen Gray's interior, and a really miraculous plan that she developed. I spent quite a bit of time explaining and learning from. Then the Villa Busk in warmer weather, the way its structure takes account of the natural world, and CISA's well-known bathhouse. As I said, the time of the body begins with a painting, and you can perhaps see the movements that are implied in this particular moment of the listener about to take the final step, but stopping so that she can overhear what the lovers in the distance are saying, guessing what they might be doing. That anticipation and recollection in spatial movement is elaborated more fully, in this case, outside of Copenhagen, indoor space and outdoor space of the Louisiana Museum. And then I think studied most fully, and I hope persuasively, in my walk through this marvelous and marvelously strange plan by Wang Shu for a guest house at the academy that he is leading as dean, but also has built almost 30 buildings on the campus. The most detailed study of movement occurs in my account of Caesar's pools. Then the last project, part of the book I told you, begins its account of the architectural project with a study of this painting, turning to Monet's Merida project, and then Pisafino-Richthausen on this beautiful site facing the Pacific in Chile, ending again with this sense of a project that's a leap into who knows what, in a kind of foggy horizon of the past, propelling itself toward the future. What I thought I'd do to give you some more concrete sense of the book is read two excerpts from the text. I hope you find them interesting. They're not too lengthy. One is from the book's introduction, and another is part of my reading of Leonardo da Vinci's rendering of the Epiphany. And before I start, I want to give a shout out to Michael Benedict, because the first line I'll read, which is the first line of the book, is one that benefited greatly from Michael's criticism and guidance. The book begins as follows. Architecture, it is said, results from the thoughtful making of space. But time is the dimension in which buildings actually come to life, how their shadows and steel engage the days and seasons of the world, how they guide movements of people and things, and how they project the past into the future, the once was into the could be. Time is not a contingent attribute of the places intended in design and realized through construction, but a key dimension of their structure and significance. Perhaps it's no surprise that time gets little direct attention in an art dedicated to permanence. Once built, we expect rooms, houses, and offices to remain as they were, as if time hadn't passed or didn't matter. Here they are, still ready for use, available now as before, rather like one's body. Although much in life changes, buildings seem not to. When we stop to think about it, probably some differences between appearances then and now will be allowed. Changes that result from deterioration, refinishing, alterations, and so on. These are, of course, changes of state, not of position. Even so, when compared to the aspects of furnishing rooms that are presently apparent, qualities that once were and will yet be, former and future phases, hardly matter, and that's by design. An architectural work is complete when what's meant to remain has been realized. As the months fade into years, the once was and now stand shoulder to shoulder, as if concurrent, no matter if the floors, walls, and roof are a little worse for wear, having suffered the effects of inhabitation and environmental influence. Endurance is a building's most basic task and chief ambition. Uncontroversial as these truisms might seem, they're contradicted by the fact that the building's photo-ready or move-in condition never lasts very long, hardly more than a season, and certainly not through the years and decades of its use, well after builders have left the site. The first hour of inhabitation inaugurates a history of modifications that only ends when the building falls to ruin or is demolished. Even then, traces remain, and thereby supply memory with a secure foothold not only for one's own recollection, but more importantly for collective memory. Traces of the wall in Berlin, for example, or that same city's memorial church on Kurfürstendamm. Famous examples aside, the beginnings of the end are often trivial. First comes scuffs on the floor and marks on the walls, then repainting, refinishing, refurnishing, leading to the insertion of new doors, windows, and partitions, and the still more significant subtractions and additions that will come later. Succession follows on the heels of inception. New appearances supplant old, veiling the initial conception, although the appearance rarely attracts notice. Retrospective views of resemblance don't overcome, they reaffirm these differences. My thesis is that a key task of design is making space for this kind of time, the time of continual change, without, however, disavowing the desire for permanence. Everyone likes landscapes of newly fallen snow before they're spoiled when the day begins. Pristine buildings have a similar appeal before the residents move in. When trying to describe the settings in which we actually live our lives, however, there's no good reason to privilege a work's first over its later appearances, nor to judge any present condition as necessarily superior to those that preceded and will follow it. The tendency among professionals, professors, and critics to concentrate on the qualities of a work that display the designer's intentions is a disciplinary prejudice, one that neglects the reality of a building's post-professional life. I realize this observation runs against the grain of most building restoration campaigns, no matter whether they're undertaken by preservationists, historians, or the designers themselves. The target of their efforts is normally the work's uninhabited condition before its years of suffering began. The truth of the matter is many buildings improve over time. Maintenance doesn't always wind the building's clock backwards. Improvement can result from modifications that compensate for inadequate foresight or faulty execution on the construction site. Positive change can also result from the installation and operation of manual instruments or today digital devices that improve a work's usefulness. They also alter its appearance. So when given just a little thought, the temporality that is peculiar to architecture is contradictory. Time maintains what it has brought into being, while it simultaneously schedules the work's transformation, ultimately its disintegration. How can the two, sameness and difference, occur concurrently? By virtue of its physicality, suitability, and familiarity, every work keeps its past present. Now, like then, the walls of this room are still plaster, timber, and glass. Its apertures and furnishings continual to allow one to use it as others have and will. In time, it will still be this room. During any of these uses, the distinction between what the setting once was and now is has no real force. The only aspects of settings that show themselves to be of the past are the few that have lost their tacit relevance. In a larger sense, this is the difference between living tradition and history. Practical involvements, abrogation between now and then, particularly when that difference has been hardened into a categorical separation. The chief impediment to grasping the reality of change is our uncritical dedication to objective or clock time, as opposed to the time of events, examples of which would include any instance of residing, talking with your friends in an apartment, working in your office, or watching a movie in the hotel room. On this point, William Faulkner had a blunt observation. He wrote, "Time is dead as long as it's being clicked off by little wheels. Only when the clock stops does time come to life." Thanks to the qualities I've just mentioned, physicality, suitability, and familiarity, every built setting not only recalls its past, but prefigures its future. In the case of a lecture room, prefiguration would anticipate the time when the next speaker or conference will begin. More prosaically, when the floor will be clean, lighting repaired, or overall appearance renewed. In other words, the room's present state continually outruns itself toward yesterday and tomorrow, impinging on each of them simultaneously. Here's the key point. Temporality is not only nor always moment by moment succession. The chronology of regular intervals, clock time, is not lived time, as Faulkner said. The past lingers into the present, just as the future prolongs it. Every now is a former future, and every future is at the same time a present yet to come. Current times in the living reality of an architectural work reassert the presence of a history which they also supersede, while they concurrently anticipate what is yet to come, though always incompletely. My general point is that past and future define essential dimensions of the work's present reality, albeit as conditions that are no longer and not yet present in the way they once were and will be. Here I'd like to propose a more compact version of my opening thesis. Architectural permanence realizes itself in time. I say in time, not through time, not diachronically, as the philosophers say, nor pathologically, as Elder Rossi once said, but synchronically, or in Rossi's terms, a propelling sort of permanence that allows adaptations and alterations. A thesis that may be more controversial is implied in this image of the past remaining present in works of architecture. Namely, buildings do not exist in time, but as time. That is, buildings stubbornly hold their ground for days, months, and years. They construct and render legible the persisting and predicting dimensions of the present. The sleepless nights in a friend's house, the sidewalk cafe lunch that passes too quickly, the dreary winters that make the apartment so confining, and so on. We can take the next step in understanding how architecture makes space for time by distinguishing the kinds that are embodied in buildings. I believe there are at least three distinct chronologies that coexist non-synchronically, yet indivisibly in all built works. I'll stop with the reading from the introduction there. The text goes on to explain the methodology of the book. And as I promised, just a couple paragraphs of what I've characterized as a close reading of single works seeking to isolate dimensions of building time. This painting is studied at the beginning of my consideration of the time of the project. In 1481, Leonardo da Vinci started work on Adoration of the Magi for the church of San Donato a Scopeto, just outside the center of Florence. Though unfinished, his ideas for the painting are clear, especially his representation of what happened during the moment of the Epiphany, the Adoration. Linear time was broken. Distant times were joined to the present in order to anticipate what's to come. I'd like to use this painting as a key to what happens in the unfolding of a design project, a no less surprising turn of events when considering given circumstances. Leonardo's composition poses a number of surprising anachronisms. Although one tends to focus on the central group of figures, given the crossing of compositional diagonals at the child's raised right hand, the margins introduce the painting's temporal propositions most directly. Figures that represent radically distinct ages are positioned at both left and right and the back and foreground. The least complicated pair appears at the painting's two sides. An elderly man stands at the extreme left, his back edging the panel. Because he's cloaked in a way that recalls the appearance of an ancient sage, some scholars see a philosopher, others the prophet Isaiah, whose account of the Epiphany seems to have guided Leonardo's thinking. Philosopher or prophet, he's wholly absorbed in thought. Arms crossed over his massive bulk, a closed left hand supports his downward turned chin. One can't really say for sure if his eyes are shut. They seem so. If not, he's looking without seeing. Not seeing, but foreseeing, or more generally, expressing inward focus, no less encircled than Rodin's thinker, who is similarly self-enclosing and concentric, though seated. Another sculptural comparison is Michelangelo's Lorenzo de' Medici, who also embodies contemplative life, with downcast eyes, knuckled chin, and sealed lips, closed in on himself, brooding and undistracted. In Leonardo's version, the sage saint's concentricity suggests isolation from the action at the center, as if the past he represents were a closed book. We'll see it wasn't. On the painting's right side stands the elder's polar opposite, a youthful figure, entirely outgoing and animated, also more limber, twisting on his vertical axis, contrapposto, right and left arms turned toward the center, but eyes in the opposite direction. Who knows where, not just here, toward something just departed or not yet arrived. He could be greeting a latecomer to the event we see. Some critics have said, this is a youthful self-portrait, but not explained why that would make sense given the Epiphany theme. The figure's equivalent in the Medici chapel would be Giuliano de' Medici, who is also poised to act, though not oriented quite so obliquely. Some scholars see refined dress in Leonardo's figure, at least according to 15th century norms, also a figure who is well equipped. Whatever's caught his attention, its off-center location couples him to his senior on the other side because both ignore rather than adore the center. The momentous change signaled by the Epiphany takes the form of a double donation. The mother gives her child, relaxes her hold, allows his reach, while the Magi offer their treasures. More precisely, this is the moment when the infant offers his blessing without having accepted the gift which the Imagus has raised but not yet released. Geometrically, lines of sight, the mother's, child's, and Magus's, parallel the slightly lower axis of giving and receiving. The arm, wrist, and hand that offer the blessing run perpendicular to those parallels, but the index finger points upward. one assumes the sign of the cross will be traced in the air. Despite this matrix of connections, the sign of the cross, the giving or receiving, and the meeting of the eyes, the mother and child remain divided from the Magi and all they represent, I mean the Gentiles, thanks to the strong vertical line that falls from the baby's left shoulder, behind his elbow, all the way to the ground. Some distance above the child, this line reaches upward from the rock root into the leaves of the central tree. Some say the tree of Jesse from which Christ descended. But below, the line edges a purple robe, the bottom length of which folds across the ground. Despite all the twists and turns of times and places around her, the mother sits rather calmly at the painting's center. Panel is nearly square. Diagonals from its corners cross near her chin. She too indicates divergent interest. She'd seem lifeless if she didn't. Her lower half turns outward along the line that extends from her right foot, while her upward inclination and focus parallel the line that coordinate the gift and the blessing. At the same time that her inclination and tilt combine giving and caring, she also expresses calm stability, though it's hard to say if she's seated on a stone ledge or a seat of some sort. Prior to Leonardo's version of events, Mary was often shown seated on a throne, an indication of her majesty. That's not the role she's playing now. Instead, Madonna dell'Umilità. She's at home in a landscape, under one tree, the rock-rooted one, and backed up by another, possibly a palm, an emblem of peace traditionally associated with the Virgin. Like the foreground tree, she's at rest on the rock, as are the figures ringing around her, though they seem less stable. Both back and front show unshaped land. The terrain in between, the unshaped plain plus level platform, as they lie between two unshaped stones, show the task and outcome of design and construction if we were to construe this turn of events as the subject matter of an architectural project. The stable on the right and the classical building on the left tell the same story, how both primitive and sophisticated technique make use of natural conditions, conditions that not only predate design and construction, but provide them with the means of their renewal. Apart from the antecedents that preceded the present moment, the time of an event, or the time of a project, any sequel would be deprived of the context in which its accomplishments could be measured. I'll conclude by saying that in both human affairs and in project making, no such present, separated from what preceded and will follow, no such present can be said to exist. So that begins the study of the architectural project. And as you've seen, I turned to Raphael Maneo's building first, and then Piso van Ulrichshausen, the Poli house, and in both cases want to question what we mean by a project's duration, when it begins, how it develops, and when it concludes, and recall what I think Leonardo has expressed rather beautifully with Christ as the new Adam, seeing how a present moment anticipates what to come, always only insofar as it draws in its wake significant unfoldings that preceded it. I believe the same occurs in architectural work under the name of the project. That study is the most focused in this book's three parts. Preceding it, something all of us, whether we're architects or not, can understand: the temporality of movement through spaces. But the individuality of that understanding, even in its social sense, fits in a still wider context of architectural temporality, which I call the time of the world, and use to begin the book. A book that I hope you find interesting, at least as partly as interesting as I did in writing it. Thank you very much.
You often return to the underlying message that all buildings can be improved over time, and many do, and also that there is a contradicting but necessary relationship between living tradition and history. What would this understanding of architectural permanence say about the current culturally, racially charged issues within relation to buildings and statues? Clemson renaming its honors college, Oklahoma State renaming some of its campus buildings named for an overtly racist governor, statues being torn down or moved to museums. I believe arguments can be made for both renaming these buildings for the sake of improvement and leaving them as a structure that changes in time and may change again. How might you respond to that?
I like the concluding phrases of the question. What I have tried to argue in the book is that permanence is achieved most effectively through change. And some of the changes can be extremely radical, such as demolition. I don't think it's gone. I think the memory persists. One might call it beneath the surface, a subsurface recollection of what once was. We tend to think that in the absence of a physical object, nothing remains. I'm not so sure. I think there are many instances where the absence is still felt. There is something there, and it could be only in memory, but there are no doubt traces of one kind or another. So in my sense of things, it's always only a matter of degree, not of kind. It's gone or it's here. There's a wonderful text by a fairly well-known Viennese writer, Robert Musil, who, not the man without qualities, but it's called Essays from Posthumous Essays. And he has a paper on monuments, and he says the best way to consign a figure to oblivion is to make a monument to him. We have a way of overlooking what seems prominent, just as we have a way of recalling what seems to have been eroded or perhaps taken to be absent. So I'm not in favor of a categorical yes or no, keep or destroy. And I think in case by case, there should be modifications. The degree to which they're representative of widely felt interest is, I think, the second and equally pressing question. So I rather follow the line set out by Ernesto Rogers and more recently Vittorio Briganti, that in our line of work, design is always one or another form of modification, likewise of construction, that one is continually transforming. The passage that I didn't quote but have in mind comes from a marvelous historian of Christianity. His name is Yaroslav Pelikan, and he has a beautiful book called Inheritance and Tradition. And he characterizes traditionalism as the dead faith of the living, and tradition as the living faith of the dead. And there is something about phenomena being ostensibly gone that animates the creativity of historical action. And I like his account of living tradition. And I'm opposed to the idea of preserving something because at one point some people thought it was significant. I'm not sure I've answered the question fully, but I've tried to simply gloss on the last few phrases that were part of it. I have bracketed it. Um, it's something, I don't know. I think it's something that I had to put on hold for the sake of this book. I've thought a lot about our current assumptions concerning form, type, idea, and I think they are no doubt required of any project. But I think design and construction are approximations to what will last, always only approximations. So I'm more or less following Augustine's idea of time as the image of eternity. It's through change that permanence is intuited, but that intuition is probably a matter of wonder, of imagination, or of faith, something other than a topic in one's possession. So I have a small place for ideality, and I've done most of my work on how one approximates the good or the idea through design and construction. That I believe is our task.